Hello everybody and welcome back to the Fusion 360 for FTC tutorial series. This is the third video in the series, and if you haven't watched the first two videos, I recommend you do so by clicking on the card in the corner. Last video we looked at basic sketching tools in Fusion, such as the different ways to construct circles and rectangles. In this video we'll continue learning about sketches, and we'll explore some of the more advanced and complicated sketching tools within Fusion. Again, I recommend that as you watch this video, you experiment along with me using the different tools and getting used to the Fusion 360 sketching workflow. So just for a quick recap on how to create a sketch within Fusion 360, there's three ways. You can click the Create Sketch button up here, which is also found in the Create drop-down menu, or it can be found by pressing S and searching for Sketch. So we're going to go ahead and create a sketch, and we can just choose one of the three planes available to us. And it doesn't really matter right now, so I'm just going to choose the XY plane. So we're going to be starting off today with the ellipse tool. And the ellipse tool, unlike many of the other tools that we looked at, like circle and rectangle and slot, it only has one way to create it. So, and there's no shortcut, so we're just going to select that. And the first thing that we need to specify is we need to specify the center point for the ellipse. So if I go ahead and specify the center point, the next thing that it's asking us for is the first axis point, and there's two dimensions that we can specify here. We can specify the angle, which you'll later see is the rotation of the ellipse, and we can specify the distance. So if I just choose, let's say, 100 and 45 degrees, then the next thing it's asking us for is it's asking us for the height of the ellipse. So we're just placing a point which will become on the ellipse, and the dimension here is the height of the ellipse. So if I do 150, then you'll see that we have the 45 degrees, which is the rotation of the ellipse. It's rotated 45 degrees. If we change this value to 0 degrees, it'll if we change it to 0 degrees, well, I can't do it right now, but if we change it to 0 degrees, it would be rotated directly upwards. I can go ahead and show that just by doing this and going like this. It's directly upwards. And then the two dimensions we have inside the ellipse are the height and the width of the ellipse. The next tool that we're going to look at is the Fit Point Spline. So it's under the Spline menu, and there's two different types of spline. So if you click on either one, we'll just explore what they do. So the Fit Point Spline, which also is found in this top menu up here, is specified by a series of knots. And this knots it can be as many knots as you want. So there's no cap to the amount of knots you can place for a spline. So if I start here, it's now asking for the next point. And once I place this next point, we'll be able to see some interesting stuff happening here. Instead of interpolating smoothly between in a straight line between these points, instead the interpolation is based on the points that follow it and come before this point. So if I place a point directly in line with the first two knots, it will create a straight line. But if I deviate it slightly, it will begin to curve and interpolate between these points smoothly. So I can go ahead placing points, and the curve will always pass through the points. Once I'm done, once I'm happy with my spline, I can go ahead and click the check mark here, and that will complete the spline. So now we have the spline, and the actual spline itself is this blue line with the black dots signifying the knots on the spline. So if I click on the spline line, I have these green lines and green points, and these are handles for each knot. They define the spline. So if I click on one, I can go ahead and actually move it to a different place, and this changes the way that the spline interpolates between the points. So this allows you to interpolate between many points smoothly, and this method makes them go through the points that you choose. Now we can go ahead and look at the control point spline. And this one, you'll notice that the curve does not go through the points. It instead interpolates around the points. So I've picked my first 2 points, and if I start picking points afterwards, you'll notice that instead of going through the points, it's going around. And once I finish my spline, I go ahead and click the check mark again, and now we have the control point spline. And you can see that the dotted orange lines are line segments that connect the points in our control point spline, and these black points are the knots in our control point spline. So that's splines. Next, we're going to look at a conic curve. A conic curve it's a curve where you select the endpoints of it and you pick a value, which is the row value. So if I pick the first point and I pick the second point, and now I have to pick a control point for it. So you can see the light gray line is showing me what it's going to look like. If I just pick this up here, we can see we've gotten this curve, and by changing this value, we change the curve structure. So this can be any value between 0 and 1. If we look at the documentation for the conic curve, it says that it can be 3 different types of curve, which are elliptical curves, parabolic curves, and hyperbolic curves. So this one is based on just the way you place the points and the value you give it. Next, we're going to look at the circular and rectangular pattern. And that is, after that, that's going to complete it for the Create tools in the Fusion 360 sketch menu. So if I just go ahead and make myself a simple circle, pressing C for creating a center diameter circle, and I specified my circle, I can use the circular pattern and rectangular pattern to create multiple instances of the same circle. So if I'm going to create a point for the circular pattern to rotate around, I'm going to create that. I'm going to change this to construction, and I pick the circular pattern. The first thing it's asking us for is objects, and this can be as many objects as you want, and it doesn't have to be sketch geometry. It can be points. I can select this point to be patterned, so it doesn't just have to be geometry. So if I select our circle, and now it's asking for a center point, so I can select this point that we made as our center point, and now you'll see we have 3 instances of the circle, and they are in a circular path around this center point. We have some options here instead of full. Right now we're doing full. If we change this to angle, it will ask us for an angle. So if the default is 180 degrees, and instead of going around the full 360, it will just put them inside this 180 degree arc. Once we've selected which type we want, we can increase the quantity, and that can be typed in here, can be typed in here, or you can press these arrows to increase and decrease the quantity. So once we're good with the quantity, if I do 7, let's say, and the quantity is inclusive with the first one, so you have to have a quantity of 2 or greater. Once I'm done, I can click OK, and now we have 7 circles which are in a pattern around this center point here. Now if we look at the rectangular pattern is in this menu down here, and again it's asking for objects. So again you can select geometry or points or lines. So I'm going to select our circle, and now we have 2 arrows here, and if we click on these arrows, they both have a number and a distance. So the number is the quantity, and the distance is, right now it's set to spacing, so that's the distance between the center points of each object. If we did extent, it would you would specify the overall distance. So if I select spacing and I increase this to, let's say, 100. Now you'll notice that the distance between each circle is now 100, and I have 3 of them. I can decrease or increase this value, and then we can select the other axis that it's going to be patterned along. So this one, again, we can select the distance. If I choose 50, let's say, then the distance between the instances is 50, and I can decrease and increase this value. There are some other options here that you can select. If you change it to symmetric, then what it's going to do is it's going to split the instances between the 2 halves. So if I up this to 5 instances on the horizontal direction, now I'll have 2 on the right and 2 on the left, with 1 in the middle. That's a total of 5. And if I have 4 here, it's doing 2 on the top and 1 on the bottom. And if you don't want it to be symmetric, then you just choose one direction, and all the instances are in that direction. Next, we're going to be looking at the modify menu here. So let's get a new geometry to work with. And the first tool we're going to be looking at is the Filat tool. So let's create a rectangle to work with, just a center rectangle, and let's take a look at the Filat tool. So the Filat tool, you select a arc or a line to work with, and you can have an arc and a line, or it can be an arc and an arc, or a line and a line. So right now we're just going to do a line and a line. It works just the same for an arc and a line, but I'll show you something that you have to be careful of in just a moment. So we select these 2 lines, and you'll notice it gives it a rounded corner. And this rounded corner is created by having a circle at this point here, and it's getting rid of the edges extending here and making this rounded edge, which is a circle. And the distance here is the radius of the circle. So if I change this to 1, let's say, then the radius of this fillet here will be 1. So I'm going to keep that 10 for now. We can just see how that looks when I press enter, and it gives it a nice rounded corner here. Now if we look at an example with a circle and a line, so we can create a circle here to work with, and then we can create a line, let's just say like this. Notice if I tried to fillet this, it would let me select this line, but it would not let me select this circle. And that's because it has to be an arc, and the circle is not an arc. It's a full circle. It has to be a portion of the circle. So instead, if I got rid of this circle and I created an arc to work with, like this, let's say we have this arc and I created my line. Now, if I went to the Filat tool, it would let me select this. And if I selected them, it would get rid of the extending section, and again I can change this value by either typing in the box here or dragging this arrow. And again, it's just creating a arc with the radius that is specified here, and smoothly giving a nice smooth connection with these lines or arcs. Whoops, didn't mean to finish the sketch there. Next, let's look at the trim tool. So for this one, it's located under the Modify tab, and this one does have a shortcut, and by default the shortcut is T. So let's say we create this circle, and then we create a line inside of it, and the line protrudes out of the circle, and we want to get rid of the part protruding out of the circle, but we want to keep the area inside. If I just clicked on this and right clicked to give the delete option, and I click delete, it would delete the whole thing. So instead what we want to use is press T, or located up here or under the drop down. You can press T for trim, and it's going to divide up the line at the intersections of geometry. So if I wanted to delete the portion outside, I could do so by clicking here, and it would get rid of it. And now if I wanted to delete the whole circle, I could do that by using the trim tool like this, or I could use the delete tool. But the trim tool is generally for geometry that's divided up. So if I press delete, that would also work. Next, let's look at the extend tool, and we can use the same model that we have here. So the extend tool, it does somewhat the opposite of the trim tool. It extends the geometry that's specified to the closest geometry. So in this case, our line is touching the circle up here and is not touching down here. So what it's going to do is it's going to extend this line and until it's touching the circle. And this can be used with arcs or curves. So very useful for if you didn't quite reach the geometry and you just need to extend it to the nearest geometry. Next, let's look at the break tool. And the break tool is somewhat similar to the trim tool, but it kind of is a step before the trim tool. So if we create a rectangle here, and then we create a overlapping rectangle like this, and then again if we went to select the lines of the rectangle, the sides, you notice that it's selecting the whole side and it's not dividing it up where the geometry meets. So if we chose the break tool here under the drop down and we selected this line, we'd get this X here, this red X. And if we click there, now if we hover over, it's divided it up into two segments. And these segments can be used individually, such as if we wanted to fillet this like this, it could be used individually while still preserving everything here. So it instead of getting rid of the geometry like the trim tool does, it just breaks it up. So let's get rid of all of that. And we have two more tools that we're going to look at before I have a challenge for you. So the next tool we're going to look at is the sketch scale tool. And that's located under here, under the drop down, right here. So the sketch scale tool is a tool that allows you to scale sketch geometry. So I'll make two examples here. We're going to open up the sketch scale tool, and the first thing it asks us to do is select some entities. So if we select the sides of this rectangle, this is going to be scaled, and then we select the point for the rectangle to be scaled around. I'm going to select the origin for now. We get the scale factor. So if you do values below 1, it's going to shrink the size. And if you do values above 1, it's going to increase the size. And the point that it's scaling from is this point here that we selected. So if we do the same thing If we do the same thing again, we can look at what would happen if we chose a point that's outside the rectangle geometry. So if we select this point here, and then we do a scale factor of 2, you'll notice that it's not only scaling, it's moving away, and this is how it works when you pick a point that's outside of the geometry. This can also be done even though this point defines a circle. You can still use the point, you can still select this point as the scaling for the geometry. Now, a detail is that if I did a box select, it would now select, well, let me click out of everything first. If I did a box select for the entities, it would select the point that the circle is defined, and then if I tried to select that again, it would not let me. So you have to be careful when doing box selects and doing a sketch scale. And lastly, we're going to look at the offset tool. And the offset tool takes sketch lines and sketch curves, sketch arcs, anything, and you can offset the geometry. So if I select this circle to be offset, what you'll notice here is there's this red line here, and that usually you think would mean something's being deleted, but in this position it means that something's being added. So this value here is the distance of the offset lines to the distance of the original geometry. So if I increase this distance to 5, let's say, the distance between this is 5 millimeters, and the diameter of the outer circle is 10 millimeters. If I press flip, it's going to flip to -5, and instead it's going to be bringing the geometry inside. Now, if let's say we selected this and we tried to offset the offset we just did, it would give us an error. You're not supposed to offset offsetted curves. So instead we would select this, and if we want to bring it in 5 millimeters inside the one we just did, we could do -10, and that would do that properly. When you're doing offset with a non-curved like the circle, it's just one continuous curve. With the rectangle before, if we went out, you'll notice we're selecting one line at a time. But when we go into the offset tool, it selects all of them connecting, and this is because the chain selection is on. If we turn this off, you'll notice it only selects one line at a time. So if you only want to do one, you would turn that off, and if you want to get Fusion to automatically detect that you want to do all of them here, you would turn that back on, and it would scale like normal. So that's the offset tool. Now we have the challenge, my challenge for you. So my challenge to you is to recreate this here only using one of these top create tools. You can only use one, and you can only use it once. Everything else has to be done with either these tools or these tools. And I can zoom in to show you what it looks like. This is the basic geometry here. And a little hint, this curve right here is a conic curve. So do your best to replicate this as best as you can. And I encourage you to pause the video and give it a try now. Okay, hopefully you've had a moment to try it out yourself, and now we're going to take a look at how I did this, my solution to doing this. So the first thing we want to create is this is obviously a if this is the original geometry, what you have here is you have a circular pattern creating the instances around it, and we can see that there's 3 instances, so we'll have to remember that. We have 1 here and 2 here, so plus the original, that's 3. And then out here we have these lines that are like kind of echoing the inside star. So this is a offset tool, it looks like. And then, so we're going to take a look at how we can do this. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up my points for the conic curve. So I'm going to turn the construction tool on, and I'm going to do, let's say, 10 millimeters here. And I'm going to select line again, and I'm going to do 10 millimeters this direction. And we're going to place that. And now we have our points here, and I'm going to do that again in the Y. So I'm going to go 10 millimeters and 10 millimeters. A little pop-up. Don't mind that. Now let's create our conic curve. So I'm going to create the curve like this. I'm going to select. We're going to turn construction off. Select the second point and select the last point, somewhat like this, and that looks fine with me. Now there are two methods here. We can create another curve. We can do a circular pattern here, or we can create the remaining. We can do a circular pattern, we can mirror this curve, or we can create the remaining 4. I'm just going to create the remaining 4 for now, but you could definitely mirror this over this line or do a circular pattern. If I go ahead and create the next one, you know what, I'm going to mirror this just to make sure it's all the same. Let's go like that, and then we can create the next curve on the right here. That looks about the same to me. We can mirror this, and now we have our 4 curves here. And in this one, we didn't have the lines going through in the middle, so we're going to pick the trim tool here, and we're going to get rid of all of this here. And now we have our basic shape that we had in this. Obviously, it looks a little bit different, but it's basically the same. Now we're going to use the circular pattern around this middle point to create that. Well, first, actually, I'm going to offset this, and I'm just going to do 5 millimeters, or -5. There you go. And press enter, and now we're going to use the circular pattern tool. So I'm going to select my curves here to pattern, and then I'm going to leave it on full, and I'm going to select the center point here, and we're just going to leave it on 3 like it is in my example. I'm going to press enter, and now we have what we have down here. And now the last tool that we're going to use is the rectangular pattern tool. And what I'm going to do for this one is use the box select to make sure we get everything. We got everything like that. And then I'm just going to pick a distance that looks good. I think 100 millimeters that way, and we can do the same up here. So we can do 100 millimeters. And now we have, looks pretty similar to my example. If we zoom in a little bit and compare, looks pretty similar. So hopefully you found that solution or a different solution that gives you something that looks pretty similar. That is all for today's video. In the next video, we'll be looking at this menu, which we haven't even touched yet. You may have been wondering what's in here. These are the constraining tools, the sketch constraint tools. Next video is going to be pretty in depth on what these are and how to use them effectively in your sketches. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.